I was sitting in the back of a black town car when my phone buzzed for the third time that morning. The driver, a quiet man named Harold who had worked for my husband for 11 years, kept his eyes on the road, pretending not to notice that my hands were shaking. Outside the tinted window, the oak trees lining Sycamore Ridge Drive were beginning to turn, their leaves catching the October light in shades of amber and rust. Beautiful. My husband, Edward, had always loved this time of year. He used to stand at the kitchen window with his coffee, watching the leaves fall, saying that there was something honest about a tree that let go of everything without a fight. Edward had been dead for 8 days. I looked down at my phone. The notification was from Instagram, a public post. My daughter Carolyn had tagged the location, the Orchard House, a private event venue in Greenwich that cost $4,000 to rent for an afternoon. The photo showed my grandson Tyler, 5 years old, gap-toothed smile, wearing a blue party hat, surrounded by balloons and streamers and a crowd of people I recognized. My son-in-law Brett, my son Daniel and his wife Heather, my grandchildren, Carolyn's friends, the neighbors from the cul-de-sac, Edward's college roommate and his wife, people who had stood at my husband's graveside just 8 days earlier and pressed my hands and told me to call any time, day or night. Tyler's birthday was October 14th. Today was October 15th. They had held the party yesterday. Nobody had called me. Nobody had texted. Nobody had sent a card to the house saying, "Mom, we're doing something small for Tyler. Hope you're feeling up to it." Nothing. I had spent the previous afternoon sitting alone in the sunroom with a pot of chamomile tea and a novel I couldn't read, wondering if perhaps I should call the children, wondering if I was being too withdrawn, wondering if grief had made me difficult to be around. And the entire time, 11 miles away, my family was singing Happy Birthday to my grandson in a venue decorated with the color scheme I had personally chosen for his nursery when he was born. I put the phone face down on the leather seat. Harold glanced in the rearview mirror. "Everything all right, Mrs. Calloway?" "Turn around," I said. "Take me to the Orchard House." If you've ever stood at the edge of something and known, truly known, in the cold, quiet center of your chest, that your life was about to divide itself permanently into before and after, then you understand what I felt during that 12-minute drive. I wasn't angry yet. Anger would come later, clean and useful and precise. What I felt in that car was something older and stranger. It was the particular stillness of a woman who has just understood something she had been refusing to understand for a very long time. Before I tell you what happened when I walked through those doors, I want you to do something for me. If this story is already making your heart pound, hit that like button right now and subscribe if you haven't already. Because what I'm about to share with you is the kind of story that doesn't seem possible until you lived it yourself. Leave me a comment below, telling me if you've ever been blindsided by the people you loved most. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because to understand what happened at that birthday party and what happened in the weeks that followed, you need to understand who I was before any of this began. You need to understand the woman I was before Edward, and the woman I became beside him, and the woman I was forced to become after. But first, let me tell you what Carolyn said when she saw me walk through that door. She was standing near the dessert table, holding a glass of Prosecco, wearing a cream-colored blouse I had bought her for Christmas 2 years ago. She looked well-rested. She looked, frankly, like a woman who had not recently buried her father. When she saw me, her expression moved through several phases in rapid succession. Surprise, irritation, and then something that settled into a cold kind of composure that I recognized because I had watched her practice it since she was 16 years old. Carolyn had always been the composed one, the strategic one, the one who thought 3 moves ahead. She set down her glass. She walked across the room. The conversations nearest to her tapered off, the way conversations do when something is about to happen. By the time she reached me, at least 20 people were watching. "Mom." Her voice was perfectly level. "This is a private family event." "I'm aware," I said. "I'm family." She tilted her head slightly. That particular gesture she had, like a professor about to correct a student's fundamental misunderstanding. "Actually," she said loudly enough that there was no question she intended to be heard, "now that the probate process has begun, and given the legal situation with the estate, I think it's best if you understand that this—" She gestured at the room, at the balloons, at my grandson, who was now watching us from across the room, with his party hat slightly askew. "Is no longer your family, in the way you might be thinking." The room was very quiet. I looked at my daughter. I looked at the face I had held in my hands in the delivery room 29 years ago, wet and screaming and utterly new to the world. I thought about the night she had called me from college at 2 a.m, crying so hard she couldn't speak. I thought about the afternoon I had driven 4 hours in a snowstorm because she'd had a miscarriage and didn't want to be alone. I thought about every birthday and every Christmas and every ordinary Tuesday, when I had been there, simply and completely there, the way mothers are there. I didn't say any of that. I said, "Okay, sweetheart." And I turned around and I walked back out the door. Because Carolyn had no idea, not the faintest shadow of an idea, what was already in motion. She didn't know about the envelope. She didn't know about the meeting I had scheduled for Monday morning. She didn't know what Edward had done, quietly and methodically, over the last 3 years of his life. She thought she had won. She was so breathtakingly wrong. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this story actually begins. To a small town in western Pennsylvania. To a girl with second-hand shoes and a library card. To the very first morning, I understood that the only person I could ever truly rely on was myself. I grew up in Millhaven, Pennsylvania, a former steel town that had been slowly exhaling since the mill closed in 1979. By the time I was born, in 1968, the exhale had become a long, quiet collapse. The downtown had 3 vacant storefronts for every open business. The high school had a football team that won regionals twice in a decade, and a guidance counselor who told girls like me, quiet girls, studious girls, girls from families where money was something you whispered about, that a good secretarial program at the community college was a realistic and sensible goal. My father, Robert, worked at the hardware store. My mother, June, cleaned houses 3 days a week and took in alterations the other 2. They were not unhappy people. They were not unkind. But they were people who had learned, through long experience, to keep their expectations close to the ground, where they couldn't fall very far. My father's philosophy of life could be summarized in a single phrase he used constantly. Don't reach. He said it when I talked about college. He said it when I won the county essay competition, and the local paper ran a small piece about it. He said it when I told him I wanted to study law. Don't reach, Susie. You'll just fall further. I loved my father. I never once took his advice. I worked summers at the diner on Route 9, weekends at the pharmacy, and every free hour in between in the Millhaven Public Library, which smelled of old paper and industrial cleaner and which was, for the entirety of my childhood, the most important place in my world. The librarian, a small, fierce woman named Mrs. Alderman, had taken an interest in me when I was 9 years old, and had never stopped. She ordered books for me that the library didn't stock. She left articles about scholarship programs, folded inside the covers of novels she knew I'd check out. She wrote me a recommendation letter for the University of Pittsburgh that was, she told me years later, the most enthusiastic letter she had written in 32 years of librarianship. I got in. Full academic scholarship. I remember the morning the letter arrived. My mother cried at the kitchen table. My father looked at the letter for a long time, then set it down carefully, as though it were fragile, and said, "Well, I suppose you were right to reach." That was the closest he ever came to saying he was proud of me. I held it like a gift for the rest of his life. I was 22 years old, finishing my junior year at Pitt, when I met Edward Calloway. He wasn't supposed to be in the library that afternoon. He was visiting a friend on campus. He had graduated 2 years earlier and was already working at his father's investment firm in New York. And he had wandered into the stacks because, as he told me much later, he had an incurable habit of walking into any library he passed, the way some people can't walk past a bakery without going in. I was sitting at a table near the window with 4 textbooks open and a notepad full of case citations, preparing for a constitutional law exam that had been occupying roughly 90% of my waking thoughts for 2 weeks. He sat down across from me without asking. He opened a book he had pulled from the nearby shelf, a collection of Chekhov short stories, which I later learned he had already read twice. And he read quietly for 40 minutes without saying a single word to me. Then he looked up and said, "You've been on the same page for 20 minutes. Either that's the most interesting page in the history of legal scholarship, or something is wrong." I looked up. He was, and I say this not with the soft glow of nostalgia, but with the objective assessment of a woman who spent 41 years looking at him, a remarkably handsome man. Dark hair going silver at the temples even at 24, which seemed impossible, but was simply the Calloway genetics asserting themselves early. Grey eyes that were either warm or shrewd, depending on what you were saying, and whether he believed you. A good jaw, the kind of stillness in his posture that you don't encounter often, the stillness of someone who is genuinely comfortable in silence. "I'm fine," I said. "You have ink on your left hand from where you've been gripping your pen for 3 hours," he said. "And you've been staring at the same paragraph since I sat down. I have a sister who does that. It means her mind has gone somewhere and her eyes haven't caught up yet." I looked down at my hand. There was indeed a long smear of blue ink along the side of my palm. "I'm worried about failing this exam," I said, because something about the way he spoke invited honesty. "What's your name?" "Susan Hartley." "Edward Calloway." He extended his hand across the table. "Tell me about the exam. Sometimes explaining it out loud is the only way to understand what you actually know." We talked for 2 hours. He knew almost nothing about constitutional law. His degree was in economics. But he asked questions with a precision and genuine curiosity that forced me to articulate things I had only half understood, and in articulating them I understood them fully. When I finally closed my books and looked out the window, it was dark. "I think I'm going to pass now," I said. "I think you were always going to pass," he said. "You just needed to hear yourself think." He asked me to dinner. I said I had to study. He said he would be in Pittsburgh for 2 more days, and asked if he could come back tomorrow. I said there was no way to stop him, since it was a public library. He smiled, a smile I would learn to love unreasonably in the years ahead, slightly crooked, entirely genuine, and said that was good enough for him. We were engaged 14 months later. My father met Edward at Thanksgiving of my senior year and shook his hand for a long time at the front door, looking at him with an expression I couldn't quite read. Later, washing dishes, he said to me quietly, "He looks at you like you're the whole answer." I didn't know what that meant then. I do now. Edward's family was another matter. The Callaways of Greenwich, Connecticut were old money in the particular way that old money expresses itself in New England. Not in ostentation, but in a kind of quiet, marble-smooth certainty that the world was arranged correctly and that their place in it was simply the natural order of things. Edward's father, William Callaway Sr., ran the investment firm with the focused intensity of a man who had never once doubted his own judgment. His mother, Catherine, was charming in the way of someone who had spent 60 years being charming as a professional requirement and had long since ceased to distinguish between genuine warmth and its performance. They were not unkind to me. They were careful with me, the way you are careful with something you are not entirely sure belongs in your house. I heard Catherine, at our engagement party, tell a friend in the next room. "She's very bright. Edward always did have a weakness for projects." I never told Edward. There was no point. He would have been wounded and she would have denied it, and nothing would have changed. I filed it away in the place where I kept things that were true but not useful, and I went back into the room and I smiled and I shook hands and I was, as I had learned to be from a very young age, exactly as good as I needed to be. Edward and I were married in June of 1992 in a ceremony at the Callaway estate that his mother had orchestrated with the thoroughness of a military campaign. I wore a dress that cost more than my father made in a year. I remember standing in the upstairs bathroom before the ceremony, looking at myself in the mirror and thinking, "This is not your world yet, but it will be. You will earn it. You will build something here that is genuinely yours, and you will not let anyone take it from you." I did not know, standing there in that bathroom in my borrowed pearls, that 31 years later, I would be standing in a courthouse, thinking almost exactly the same thing. We moved to New York first, a brownstone in the West Village that Edward's father purchased as a wedding gift, which gave me complicated feelings I worked out over several years of very expensive therapy. I had been accepted to Columbia Law School, and Edward commuted to the Callaway firm while I studied. Those years, 1992 to 1995, were the happiest years of my young life, and I say that without qualification. We were broke in the way that people who are not actually broke are sometimes temporarily broke, living on takeout containers and Edward's salary and the particular freedom that comes from being at the very beginning of something. We fought about small things and agreed about large ones. We read to each other in bed. We had a small garden on the roof that Edward tended with an attention and care that seemed disproportionate to its size, but was, I came to understand, simply the way Edward did everything. Carolyn was born in 1995, 2 months after I passed the bar. Daniel came 3 years later. They were extraordinary children, not because I am their mother, and therefore obligated to say so, but because they genuinely were. Carolyn was sharp and curious, and intensely social, the kind of child who walked into rooms and immediately understood their architecture. Daniel was gentler, more interior, with a gift for mathematics that manifested early, and a sweetness of temperament that he got from his father. I loved them with the specific ferocity that I think only mothers who grew up feeling slightly precarious in the world can understand. Not the comfortable love of the secure, but the fierce, watchful love of someone who knows exactly how quickly things can change. We moved to Greenwich in 2001 when William Sr. retired and handed the firm to Edward. The house on Sycamore Ridge Drive had been in the Callaway family since 1958, a Georgian colonial on 3 acres with a pond out back and a kitchen that had been renovated twice since the original, but still had the original oak beams in the ceiling, dark with age and beautiful. I had always loved that house. There was something in its solidity, its permanence, that quieted something in me that had never been entirely quiet. The girl from Millhaven, who grew up watching her parents count change at the kitchen table, stood in that kitchen and breathed and felt, for the first time in her life, for that the ground beneath her was truly firm. I continued to practice law. I had joined a mid-sized firm in New York after the bar and specialized in estate planning, which strikes people as either ironic or prophetic in retrospect, depending on their sense of humor. I worked reduced hours after the children were born, not because Edward asked me to, but because I chose to, and I want to be precise about that distinction because it will matter later. I chose it. I was good at my work and I loved it, and I also loved being present for my children's lives in a way my own mother had not always been able to be. I found a balance. It was imperfect, as all balances are, but it was mine. The Callaway firm prospered. Edward was a careful, intelligent manager, not a spectacular one. He lacked his father's appetite for risk, but careful and intelligent over 30 years adds up to something substantial. By 2010, the firm managed roughly $400 million in assets. By 2018, that number had approximately doubled. The house on Sycamore Ridge Drive had been fully renovated. We had a place on the Cape. We traveled. We gave to causes we believed in. We were, by any reasonable measure, wealthy people who had built something real together. I want to pause here and say something clearly because it matters to everything that comes later. That wealth was ours, not Edward's, not his family's, ours. I had contributed 30 years of my professional earnings to our household. I had managed every domestic and logistical aspect of our lives with a competence and consistency that freed Edward to build his career. I had raised 2 children. I had, on more occasions than I can count, smoothed the social and professional difficulties that arose at the intersection of Edward's ambition and his occasional social bluntness. When I tell you what happened after he died, I want you to remember this. I want you to remember that I was not a woman who had simply stood beside a wealthy man and benefited from proximity. I was a woman who had built something alongside him, with my own hands, and what was built was ours. The first sign, the very first one, the one I dismissed so completely that I am still faintly embarrassed by it, came at Christmas 2019. We were all together at the house, Carolyn and Brett and their 2 children, Daniel and Heather and the twins, Edward's mother Catherine, then 84, and still formidable, my own mother, who was 81, and had been living in a very good assisted living facility in Greenwich for 3 years. It was the kind of Christmas that looks perfect in photographs, and is, in fact, largely perfect in reality. Good food, good wine, the particular warmth of a house full of people you love. But after dinner, when the children had gone to watch a movie in the den, and the adults were sitting around the table with the remnants of dessert and a second bottle of wine, Carolyn said something. She said it lightly, in the tone of someone making casual conversation, but I caught it because I had spent 30 years practicing the particular skill of catching things that were said lightly but meant heavily. She said, "Daddy, have you thought about the foundation idea at all? Brett and Daniel and I were talking, and we really think it could be a wonderful structure." Edward set down his wineglass. "What foundation idea?" "You know, we mentioned it at Thanksgiving. A family charitable foundation. You and Mom could transfer some of the assets, the Cape House, maybe some of the investment accounts, into the foundation structure. and then we'd all have roles in administering it. It would be a wonderful tax vehicle, and it would mean the estate is already organized when—" She paused. "When that becomes relevant." I watched Edward's face. It did a thing it sometimes did when he was being careful. A slight flattening around the eyes. A neutrality that was itself a kind of expression. "That's an interesting idea," he said. "I'll think about it." I didn't say anything, but that night, lying in the dark after Edward had fallen asleep, I thought about the word structure. I thought about the phrase, "when that becomes relevant." I thought about the fact that Carolyn had apparently been discussing this with Brett and Daniel at Thanksgiving, which was a conversation I had not been included in or informed about. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that it was a reasonable thing for adult children to think about, that any responsible family ought to have these conversations, that Carolyn was simply being practical. She was a practical person. She had always been a practical person. I turned over and went to sleep. I was wrong to. Over the next 2 years, the idea of the foundation came up 4 more times. Each time Edward deflected it pleasantly, and nothing happened. But I began to notice other things. I noticed that Carolyn had taken a keen new interest in the firm, dropping by the office, asking questions about specific accounts, requesting introductions to Edward's key advisors and attorneys. I noticed that Brett, who was a commercial real estate attorney, had been having what he described as casual lunches with Martin Greaves, who was Edward's estate attorney and had been for 20 years. I noticed that Daniel, who was generally the less strategic of the 2 children, seemed to be following Carolyn's lead in a way that was slightly new, agreeing with her more readily, echoing her suggestions, deferring to her assessments in conversations that included all of us. I noticed these things, and I continued to do what I had always done. I filed them in the place where I kept things that were true, but not useful, and I focused on the present, which in 2021 and 2022 was increasingly dominated by Edward's health. He had been diagnosed with a heart condition in 2019, a thickening of the left ventricular wall, which his cardiologist managed carefully with medication and quarterly monitoring. It was not, initially, alarming. Edward was in good health otherwise, disciplined about diet and exercise, and Dr. Peterson was one of the best cardiologists in Connecticut. We adjusted. We made modifications. We stopped worrying mostly. But in the spring of 2022, things began to shift. Edward tired more easily. He came home from the office earlier. He sat with his coffee at the kitchen window longer, watching the birds at the feeder, watching the season change with a quality of attention that was somehow different from how he had always watched it before. Less casual, more deliberate, as though he were consciously storing something. I brought this up with Dr. Peterson. He adjusted medications. He ordered additional tests. He was reassuring in the careful, qualified way of doctors who are being honest without being alarming, which is to say, he was somewhat alarming. In July of 2022, Edward called his attorney, Martin Greaves. I was not in the room for that call. I did not know what was discussed, and this, I would later understand, was entirely deliberate. In September of 2022, Edward asked me to drive with him to Litchfield County on a Saturday afternoon. He said he wanted to look at some land. I assumed he was thinking about the Cape property. We had discussed vaguely the idea of a larger place. But the drive took us to a different part of Connecticut entirely, up through the hills to a very small town called Hartwell, and down a long unpaved road to a property I had never seen. It was a farmhouse, white clapboard, maybe 1900, sitting on 42 acres of meadow and woodland, with a brook running along the eastern edge of the property. It needed work. The porch was soft in places. The kitchen was a disaster. 2 of the upstairs windows had been boarded over. But the bones were extraordinary. The meadow sloped gently to the tree line, and the afternoon light fell across it in long golden panels that made it look like something out of a painting. "What is this?" I said. Edward stood beside me in the long grass, hands in the pockets of his barn coat, looking at the house with an expression I hadn't seen before. "It's been in the market for 8 months," he said. "I've been looking at it for 6. Looking at it for what? He turned to look at me then directly, with that gray-eyed steadiness of his. "I want you to have something that's yours," he said. "Entirely yours. Not the Calloway estate, not the family firm, not anything that can become complicated. Just yours." I was quiet for a moment. The brook made a sound in the distance. A hawk moved somewhere above the tree line. "Edward," I said carefully, "is there something you need to tell me?" He was quiet for a long time. The hawk disappeared over the trees. "I need you to trust me," he said. "For the next year or so, I need you to trust that I am doing things in the right order for the right reasons, and that everything will be clear when it needs to be clear. Can you do that?" I had trusted this man since he sat down across from me in a library and asked me to explain constitutional law to him. I had trusted him through 30 years of marriage and 2 children, and more ordinary Tuesday mornings and extraordinary Saturday afternoons than I could count. "Yes," I said. "We bought the farmhouse that November. It was titled entirely in my name. I paid for it with my own funds. Money from my professional earnings that I had kept in a separate investment account since the early years of our marriage. A habit I had maintained simply because it felt wise. The kind of quiet financial independence that women who grew up watching their mothers count change tend to build for themselves without always being able to articulate why. I told the children we had bought a second property. I said it was a project, something to renovate. Carolyn asked about the address, and I gave it to her without thinking twice. I did not understand then that she immediately gave it to Brett to research. Edward died on September 3rd, 2023. He was sitting in the kitchen with his morning coffee, watching the birds at the feeder, and his heart simply stopped. The coroner said it was fast. Dr. Peterson said it was consistent with what they had been monitoring. The paramedics were there in 8 minutes, which was not fast enough. I had been upstairs. I came downstairs and found him in the chair, and I called 911, and then I sat down on the kitchen floor beside him, and I held his hand, and I talked to him quietly until the ambulance came, because I could not think of anything else to do. There are things about those first weeks that I am not going to describe in detail, because some things are not content. Some things are simply life, raw and irreducible, and they belong only to the people who lived them. I will say only that I moved through those weeks in the way that people who have spent their lives being competent move through devastation, on automatic, doing the necessary things, holding the form of themselves together with the particular exhausted discipline of someone who knows, somewhere below thought, that if they stop moving, they might not start again. The children were there, initially. Carolyn organized the funeral with the efficiency she brought to everything. Daniel sat with me in the evenings and didn't try to fix anything, which was the right instinct and which I was grateful for. There were casseroles and flower arrangements, and a constant low tide of people moving through the house. There was a funeral at the Congregational Church that Edward had attended twice a year, on Christmas and Easter for his entire adult life. And there were 300 people in the pews, which surprised me until I remembered that Edward had known everyone worth knowing in this part of Connecticut for 30 years. And then, 9 days after the funeral, the calls started. The first was from Martin Greaves. He called me on a Wednesday morning, and his voice had a quality I recognized from my own professional practice. The careful formality of someone who is about to say something difficult and is choosing each word with precision. "Susan," he said, "I think we need to meet. There are some elements of Edward's estate planning that are somewhat more complex than you may be aware of, and I want to walk you through them carefully before the probate process formally begins." "How complex?" I said. A pause. "Complex in a way that will ultimately work in your favor," he said, "but complex enough that I want to be sure you have complete information before your children's attorney contacts you." "My children have an attorney?" Another pause. Longer. "Brett filed a motion last week," Martin said, "to begin the formal probate process and to contest certain aspects of Edward's estate structure. I've been expecting it, frankly. Edward expected it too. That's why he made the preparations he did." I sat down. Through the kitchen window, the birds were at the feeder. A chickadee, 2 house sparrows, a cardinal, the male, impossibly red against the October sky. "Martin," I said, "tell me everything." What Martin told me over the next 2 hours, sitting across from each other in his office on Mason Street, with a pot of coffee and a stack of documents between us, was both more and less surprising than I had expected. The less surprising part, Carolyn and Daniel, advised by Brett, had been planning to contest Edward's will. They had retained a probate litigation attorney named Jeffrey Hartwell. No relation to my maiden name, though I confess the coincidence gave me a dark moment of amusement, and they intended to argue that Edward had lacked testamentary capacity in the final years of his life, and that certain transfers of assets had been made under what they would characterize as undue influence. The undue influence, I gathered, was supposed to be mine. Let me be very clear about what they were claiming. They were claiming that I had manipulated my husband, a man of exceptional intelligence and lifelong financial acumen, a man who had been managing hundreds of millions of dollars in investments well into the year before his death, into restructuring his estate in ways that disadvantaged his children. They were claiming, in essence, that I had taken advantage of a sick old man. They were claiming this about a man who had spent the last 3 years of his life doing something so careful, so deliberate, so architecturally precise, that when Martin finally laid it all out for me, I sat in silence for almost 5 minutes, looking at the documents, feeling something I can only describe as a grief that was also, somehow, a form of awe. Here is what Edward had done. Beginning in October 2020, 14 months before he bought the farmhouse, 3 years before he died, Edward had quietly restructured his estate with Martin's help. The family firm that William Sr. had built, and Edward had spent 30 years growing, had been placed into a trust structure with independent professional trustees. The trust was designed to run the firm for a minimum of 10 years before any liquidation or distribution could occur, and the distribution schedule was carefully constructed to ensure that Susan Calloway, that I, received not less than 51% of distributions in any calendar year in perpetuity as the primary beneficiary. Carolyn and Daniel were named as secondary beneficiaries. They would receive meaningful distributions. They were not cut out, but they were unmistakably, architecturally, deliberately secondary. The Cape property had been transferred to an LLC owned entirely by a revocable trust that Edward had amended 6 months before his death. The primary beneficiary of that trust was also me, The house on Sycamore Ridge Drive, the Calloway family house, the Georgian colonial with the oak beams and the pond, had been titled in joint tenancy with right of survivorship since we moved in, which meant it passed to me automatically on Edward's death outside of probate entirely, beyond the reach of any contest. And then there was the farmhouse, my farmhouse in my name, purchased with my money, which had never been part of the estate at all, and which no probate proceeding could touch. Edward had also, with a thoroughness that made me press my hand flat against my sternum, just to feel something solid, documented everything. There were letters, printed, signed, and notarized letters, written at quarterly intervals over the final 2 years of his life, attesting to his clear mental state, his understanding of the estate structure, and the reasons for his decisions. His financial advisor had written a letter. Dr. Peterson had written a letter. There were video depositions, actual recorded depositions, conducted by Martin, in which Edward sat across a table and answered questions about his estate planning decisions, with the calm precision of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and exactly why and who was making absolutely certain that there would be no question about it later. Martin slid one final document across the table. It was a letter, handwritten, addressed to me. "He asked me to give you this when the time came," Martin said. "He wrote it 8 months ago. I will not tell you exactly what the letter said. Some things are not content. But I will tell you that he had written, near the end, 'You trusted me in that field, and I need you to know that I have not wasted that trust. Everything that follows will be uncomfortable. But uncomfortable is not the same as unfair, and Susan Hartley Calloway has never in her life been afraid of uncomfortable.'" I folded the letter. I put it in my bag. I looked at Martin Greaves across the stack of documents. "So what happens now?" I said. "Now," Martin said, "Jeffrey Hartwell files his motion, and we respond, and then we let Edward's work speak for itself." In the weeks that followed, the weeks during which my daughter had told me, in front of 20 people at my grandson's birthday party, that I was no longer part of her family, here is what was also happening, invisibly, in the formal language of the Connecticut Probate Court. Jeffrey Hartwell filed a motion contesting the estate structure on grounds of alleged undue influence and questions of testamentary capacity. The motion was thorough. It cited the timing of the trust amendments. It cited the fact that I was an estate planning attorney and therefore had professional knowledge that could have been used to manipulate the process. It cited Edward's health condition. It was, professionally speaking, a well-constructed document. Martin Greaves filed a response that was 47 pages long and included as exhibits the quarterly notarized letters, the financial advisor statement, the medical statement from Dr. Peterson, and 3.5 hours of video deposition footage showing Edward Calloway explaining, in his own voice and his own words, exactly what he had done and exactly why. It also included as a late-filed exhibit a document that Jeffrey Hartwell had apparently not known existed. A document that Martin had been sitting on since October 2022, waiting for the moment when it would be most useful. It was a transcript of a recorded conversation between Carolyn and Brett, recorded by Edward on his phone, legally in Connecticut, which is a one-party consent state, during a dinner at the Sycamore Ridge House in October 2022. In that conversation, Brett had outlined, in considerable detail, the legal strategy that he and Carolyn intended to pursue after Edward's death. He had explained the undue influence argument. He had explained the testamentary capacity argument. He had discussed, in the clinical language of a real estate attorney who had done some research into probate litigation, exactly how they intended to challenge the estate structure. Carolyn had contributed suggestions. The conversation lasted 31 minutes. Edward had sat at his own dinner table and listened to his daughter and son-in-law plan, in detail, how they intended to take apart everything he had built, and he had said nothing, and he had recorded everything, and he had given the recording to Martin with instructions to produce it at the appropriate moment. I was not in that room when Martin produced the transcript, but I heard about it afterward from Martin himself, who described Jeffrey Hartwell's expression when the document was introduced with a precision and satisfaction that told me he had been looking forward to that moment for quite some time. What followed, legally speaking, was swift. Jeffrey Hartwell filed a brief attempting to argue the recording was irrelevant or prejudicial. The judge, a woman named the Honorable Patricia Vaughn, who had been on the probate bench for 16 years, and whose reputation for both intelligence and impatience was well established, disposed of this argument in a written order that occupied 3 paragraphs and contained, in its final sentence, the phrase, "Counsel's argument is without merit," and reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of established Connecticut evidentiary standards, which is, in the formal language of judicial opinions, essentially the equivalent of a very elegant eye roll. The contest was dismissed. The estate structure was upheld. The firm remained in trust. The Cape property remained in trust. The house on Sycamore Ridge Drive was mine. The farmhouse, which had never been in question, remained mine. The hearing at which the dismissal was issued was a Thursday morning in December, 4 months after Edward's death. I sat in the second row. Martin had advised me not to sit in the front, for reasons of optics, and I wore a grey wool dress and the pearl earrings Edward had given me for our 25th anniversary, and I held in my lap a small envelope that contained his letter to me, which I had taken to carrying the way some people carry rosary beads. Carolyn and Daniel sat across the aisle with Brett and Jeffrey Hartwell. Carolyn was wearing a black coat I had never seen before. She had her hair pulled back. She was, as always, composed. But when Judge Vaughn read the dismissal, I watched her composure do something I had seen it do only a handful of times in 29 years. It didn't break exactly. It simply became unsustainable. It became the composure of someone holding a very heavy thing and realizing they could not hold it much longer. Daniel beside her put his face in his hands. I did not look at them after that. I looked at the front of the room, at the seal of the state of Connecticut on the wall above the bench, and I breathed. Outside the courthouse, the December sky was the particular pale blue of very cold, clear days, the kind of blue that has no warmth in it but is beautiful anyway. Harold was waiting with the car at the bottom of the steps. I stood on the steps for a moment before I went down, breathing the cold air, feeling the sun, thin and far away, and entirely unhelpful for warmth, on my face. Martin came out behind me. He stood beside me for a moment, not saying anything. Then, "Edward would have enjoyed that." "He engineered that," I said. "Completely. We just showed up." Martin smiled. "That is, in fact, the best kind of legal victory." I want to tell you now about the weeks after the hearing, because they matter. Carolyn called me 4 days later. I let it go to voicemail. She called again the following day. I let that go too. On the 3rd call, I answered. She said she wanted to explain. She said she had been afraid of being pushed out, afraid of being treated the way she had watched Edward's brother's children be treated when William Sr. died, and the estate was contested, afraid that I would sell everything and move on, and they would be left with nothing. She said Brett had convinced her that the legal strategy was protective, not aggressive. She said she was sorry about the birthday party. She said she was sorry about what she had said. She was not wrong about everything she said. Fear does make people do terrible things. I know this. I have known it my whole life. But there is a particular kind of sorry that is really a request. A request to return to the way things were, to absorb what has happened into the larger story of the family, and let it become, over time, simply a difficult chapter that everyone prefers not to reread. And there is another kind of sorry that is the beginning of something genuinely different, genuinely new, genuinely built on the honesty of what has been revealed. I told Carolyn I needed time. I told her I would be in touch. Daniel called the following week. His call was shorter and simpler. He said he was ashamed. He said he should have pushed back harder. He said he missed his father, and he missed me, and he didn't know how to carry both of those things at the same time. I said I understood that. I said I missed his father too. We talked for an hour. When we hung up, I felt something shift in me that had been very, very still. It has now been 11 months since the hearing. I am sitting in the kitchen of the farmhouse in Hartwell as I record this. The renovation is about 3/4 complete, and the kitchen is finished, and it is beautiful. With the original stone fireplace restored and new counters of reclaimed oak and windows that look out over the meadow to the tree line. I drink my coffee here every morning. I watch the season change over the meadow. In October, the foliage was extraordinary. Reds and oranges and golds laid across the hillside like something improbable, something you would dismiss as too much if you saw it in a painting. I thought about Edward every morning. I think about him every morning still. The firm continues to operate under the trust structure. The trustees are competent and careful, and the distributions have been consistent. I have resumed a part-time consulting practice, partly because I enjoy the work and partly because a woman who grew up watching her parents count change at the kitchen table does not entirely know how to not work. The Cape property is currently rented to a family from Boston who are apparently very pleased with it. The house on Sycamore Ridge Drive, I have not yet decided about. I go there sometimes and walk through the rooms and try to figure out what I feel. It is complicated. I suspect it will remain complicated for a while. Carolyn and I have had 3 dinners since the hearing. They are careful, effortful, imperfect dinners. 2 people trying to find each other again across a distance that one of them created and both of them have to cross. I do not know what we will ultimately build from what remains. I know that I love my daughter. I know that she did what she did, partly out of fear, and partly out of greed, and partly out of a failure of imagination. A failure to imagine that her father had seen all of it coming, and had been, quietly and methodically, 3 moves ahead of all of them for the last 3 years of his life. I know that I sat in the front pew at his funeral and thought about all the things I would never be able to say to him again. And I know that one of the things I would have said, if I could have, was this: I know what you did. I know how carefully you did it. I know that the last real gift you gave me was not the trust structure or the letters or the farmhouse, though I am grateful for all of those things, but the recording. Because the recording told me that you sat at your own dinner table and listened to them. And you didn't flinch. You didn't confront them. You didn't let them know you knew. You simply prepared, quietly and completely, and you trusted me to be ready when it mattered. I was ready. I will always be ready. If this story moved you, if something in Susan's journey resonated with what you've carried, or what you've witnessed, or what you've survived, please hit that like button right now subscribe so you don't miss the next story, and leave me a comment. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better? Have you ever discovered that someone you loved had been quietly protecting you all along? I want to hear your story. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded today that preparation is its own form of power, and that the most profound acts of love are sometimes the ones no one sees until exactly the right moment. I'll see you in the next one.